My brother-in-law picked up my daughter's dinner plate, her fork still resting across it. Her paper napkin folded into a neat triangle the way she always did it, carried it across the dining room, and set it down on the folding card table, propped against the hallway wall outside the door. Then he walked back, pulled her chair away from the main table while she was still standing beside it, and placed it next to the card table. He did all of this slowly, unhurried, in front of 34 members of my extended family, who had come to celebrate my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. Then he looked at me and said, "The real table is for real family, Nadine." I figured she could be more comfortable out there. Mia was 6 years old. She looked at her plate sitting outside the room. She looked at her water glass, still on the big table, forgotten. She looked at me. She didn't cry. She was the kind of child who had learned not to cry in public. She'd built that habit after my divorce, a small, specific dignity she carried around like armor. I watched her take one careful breath through her nose. The room did not go silent. That was the part that took the longest to process later. In the car, on the highway, staring at the dark road, the room did not go silent. Conversations adjusted around the moment the way water moves around a stone. My mother said, "Oh, Griffin, the appetizers are wonderful, don't you think?" My father laughed at something my uncle said at the other end of the table. My sister, Griffin's wife, my own sister, looked at her phone. I had paid for this party. Not all of it, but enough of it that it would have mattered if I said so. The deposit to the catering company, the floral arrangement on the buffet table, the custom cake from the bakery on Lebanon Road with my parents' wedding portrait printed in edible ink on the fondant. I had bought my mother's dress in September when she mentioned she hadn't found anything she liked yet and couldn't afford the one she'd seen at Dillard's. I had been sending my sister and Griffin $800 every month for 2 years, first of the month, before I paid my own credit card bill. I had co-signed for their car when Griffin's credit history from a previous bankruptcy made it impossible for them to get approved. I had put Griffin's $1,200 professional development course on my visa in February because he'd said it was going to change everything. I was 32 years old. I worked 3 12-hour shifts a week as a registered nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. My daughter and I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Nashville that I was very proud of and very careful about affording. I had spent 2 years making sure my sister and her husband had what they needed, and Griffin had just moved my daughter's dinner plate to a card table in a hallway. I stood up. The table actually did go quiet then. "Mia," I said, "come get your plate." She moved quickly, the way kids move when they know the adult in their corner has finally arrived. I walked around the table to Griffin's end, unhurried, the same pace he'd used, and I stopped close enough that he had to look up at me. I said, quietly enough that it required effort to hear, loudly enough that everyone was making that effort. "Every person in this room is going to get exactly what they've earned. I want you to remember that I said it." I took Mia's hand. We walked to the door and I opened it and we left. I did not slam it. I did not look back. I helped her into her booster seat, and I buckled the belt and I drove out of my parents' cul-de-sac in Brentwood, while the porch lights of their house disappeared in my rearview mirror. If you want to see what happened to Griffin after that night, keep watching, because what came for him was something none of them had the imagination to predict. I drove 40 minutes through dark Tennessee highway, and I did not go home. I went to Claudia's house near Sylvan Park, my father's younger sister, a woman who had been the one sane, fixed point in my family's particular orbit for as long as I could remember. Her porch light was on. It was always on. She opened the door before I knocked, looked at my face, looked at Mia half asleep against my shoulder and said, "Come in. I'll heat up the kettle." Mia was asleep on Claudia's couch under the crocheted blanket from the armchair within 15 minutes. Claudia and I sat at her kitchen table and she waited, both hands around her mug, and let me talk. I told her about the plate, about the chair, about Griffin's voice when he said it, that measured, deliberate patience that told me he had planned it, had waited for an audience large enough to make it count. I told her about my mother reaching for the breadbasket, my father pouring more wine. Claudia was quiet for a moment. She had known my parents since before my father's hair had gone gray. She was not surprised. That was somehow the worst part. The way her expression held recognition instead of shock, like she had been waiting to hear something like this for a long time. "How long have you been sending them money?" she asked. "Consistently, 2 years. Before that it was one-off things whenever Griffin had a thing, or my sister said they were short. But the monthly transfer started January before last." "And what have they given you in return?" I opened my mouth, I closed it. I thought about Griffin's social media, the posts about weekend trips to Gatlinburg, the restaurant check-ins, the photos with captions like "living our best life" and "so grateful." I thought about my sister's texts, which came in 2 varieties, the ones that were just the weekly "hello," "checking in," "love you," and the ones that explained, in careful detail, why they were going to need a little extra this month. There was always a reason. There was always a particular emergency that made refusing feel like cruelty. "Nothing," I said. "They gave me nothing." Claudia put her hand over mine on the table. "Then you don't owe them anything else. You've already given more than enough." I thought about Mia's face, that one careful breath. "I'm done," I said. Claudia nodded like she'd been waiting for that sentence, like she'd been holding the space for it. I sat there for another hour while the tea went cold and the house stayed quiet. I turned the decision over. I looked at it from every angle. I kept waiting for the guilt to show up, the familiar weight of it, the way it usually arrived right around the point where I'd made a decision that prioritized myself. It didn't come. What came instead was something I didn't immediately recognize because I hadn't felt it in years. Steadiness. Just plain, quiet steadiness. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to my sister. "I'm stopping the monthly transfers, effective today. I'm also having my name removed from the cosigner agreement on the car when the lease is up in March. I think you understand why." I sent it, turned the phone face down on Claudia's kitchen table, and didn't look at it until morning. By 7 the next day I had 41 messages. My sisters were disbelief cycling into grievance. "How could you do this? I can't believe you. It was one dinner, you're being so dramatic. Griffin didn't mean it the way you're taking it." Griffin's messages were fewer and blunter. "You owe me. You can't just walk out of an agreement. I put time into this relationship." I kept reading that last phrase. I put time into this relationship. As if sending someone money every month was a relationship, and the person sending it was the one who'd invested. My mother called twice before 9 in the morning. I sent both to voicemail. Her messages were long and exhausting in the specific way she had perfected over decades. Grief that wrapped itself around accusation, sorrow that was also blame, the tone of a woman who had learned that being wounded was more effective than being direct. "You're hurting this family, Nadine. Your father is devastated. We didn't raise you to do something like this." Nothing about Mia. Not one word about the card table in the hallway. By noon my sister had posted something on Facebook. The vague, gestural kind, the post designed for maximum reach with minimum specificity. Family is supposed to show up for each other, especially in hard times. Some people don't understand what that really means until they need it. 42 comments inside an hour. prayer hands from cousins I hadn't spoken to since a funeral in 2019. I did not post anything. I have found that silence is the cleanest possible response to that kind of theater. Griffin called on Tuesday from his cell. I let it ring. He called Wednesday from a number I didn't recognize, which was why I answered. He started immediately. You can't just decide to walk out on an arrangement. That's not how this works. There was no arrangement, I said. I made a choice to help you. Now I'm making a different choice. Both are mine to make. You co-signed for the car. The lease ends in March. I'd start figuring something out. He made a sound I had never heard before, a kind of pressurized blankness, the sound of someone encountering an obstacle where he had always found a door. Then, "You're going to regret this, Nadine." "I don't think I will," I said, and I hung up. I didn't regret it. Not when my mother called a fourth time. Not when my sister's voicemail came through, actual tears, saying I was tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. I played that word in my head on a loop, misunderstanding, as if Griffin had accidentally carried my daughter's plate to a folding table in the hallway in front of 30 people. As if his voice had been uncertain when he said it. I held the line. For the first time in as long as I could track, I just held it. It was Odette who found it. Odette worked in the billing department at Vanderbilt. We'd gotten close over shared lunch breaks and the particular bond that forms between people who see each other at their most wrung out. She was perceptive in the deliberate way that people who've had to look carefully at things their whole lives become. She noticed details that others let slide past. She knocked on the door of the break room on a Thursday afternoon in late November, closed it behind her, and sat down across from me with a printout held carefully flat on the table. "Nadine," she said, "I need you to look at something." She turned the paper to face me. It was a credit card statement. The bank's logo was at the top, one I didn't recognize as mine. My name was printed clearly below it. My last four of my social security number appeared in the account summary. I read it once, I read it again. "I was doing a billing audit cross-reference," Odette said, keeping her voice measured and low. "This account flagged because the mailing address on file is not yours. But the name, the social, the date of birth all match you exactly. The account had been opened 14 months ago. The credit limit was $9,000. The current balance was $8,538. I went through the charges line by line. 2 restaurant charges in Gatlinburg. I recognized the dates from a social media post my sister had put up. A hotel stay. 3 charges to an auto parts supplier. A payment to an LLC, the registration service in Griffin's business name. 17 ATM cash advances from a branch in Brentwood, month after month after month. 14 months. The entire time I had been transferring $800 a month. There had also been a credit card in my name, in my social, attached to my credit history, that I had never held, never seen, never signed for. "How is this possible?" I said. It came out flat, not a question. "Someone applied for this account using your personal information," Odette said. "Name, social, date of birth, probably your mother's maiden name for the security question. Those are easy to get when you're close to someone, when you've seen their paperwork." I thought about the cosigner application for the car. Griffin had prepared everything. I'd just signed where he pointed. I thought about a dozen other moments. Forms at a kitchen table, my sister handing me things to review quickly. Griffin's organized folders, his careful explanations. "I need to call the bank," I said. "Yes, and after the bank, you need to call the police." I sat in that break room for a long moment after Odette left, the statement flat on the table in front of me. I thought about the word misunderstanding, my sister's voicemail, my mother's grief. The way they had closed ranks so fast around Griffin's cruelty toward a 6-year-old. And now I was starting to understand why. Because there was so much more to protect than one dinner party scene. The bank's fraud department moved efficiently. I told them I had never opened the account, never received a card, never authorized a single charge. I emailed them everything Odette had printed. A representative told me they were opening a full fraud investigation, flagging the account as unauthorized, and that the case would likely involve notification to federal authorities. She used the phrase federal offense with the ease of someone who has said it before and is used to the silence that follows. I filed a report with Metro Nashville Police the same afternoon. I called a lawyer the following morning, Miss Pruitt. A woman Claudia had known for years who specialized in financial fraud cases. She had the precise, unhurried qualities of someone who has seen this particular situation before and knows exactly what to do with it. She told me to document everything, every Venmo transfer, every text where my sister or Griffin had referenced money, every document Griffin had handled during the car cosigner process. She told me identity theft of this nature carried federal charges and that an unauthorized credit card with $8,500 in fraudulent charges qualified without ambiguity. This is going to be serious for them, I said. If the evidence is what you're describing, she said yes. Good, I said. I surprised myself with how simply I said it. My sister called 6 days later. Her voice was the airless pitch of someone who had finally understood that what they were waiting for. Mercy, a change of heart, the old familiar pattern where I absorbed the damage and moved on, was not coming. Nadine, please. You have to tell the bank it was a mistake. They're talking about pressing charges. This could ruin everything. Kylie, I said. She went quiet. I know you knew, I said. You knew your name wasn't on that account. You knew mine was. 14 months. We were going to pay it back. With what? The $800 I was sending you every month? Silence. I'm not calling the bank, I said. I'm not withdrawing the report. What Griffin did is a federal crime. I'm going to let the law decide what happens next. You're going to destroy us over a credit card. No, I said. I'm going to let you deal with the consequences of what you did. That's different. I ended the call. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time afterward. Not crying, not exactly angry. Something closer to clarity, the feeling of finally seeing a room the way it actually is after years of squinting through someone else's preferred lighting. The investigation moved faster than I expected. 8 weeks after I filed the report, the detective assigned to the case called to tell me Griffin had been formally charged with identity theft and fraudulent use of personal financial information. The credit card company had cooperated fully with the investigation. The district attorney's office had accepted the case. Through a cousin who still talked to me, I heard the rest in pieces over the following weeks. Without my monthly transfers, and with Griffin facing legal fees and pending restitution, they couldn't cover rent. They'd moved in with his mother in Murfreesboro. The Civic went back at the end of the lease. No one had found a cosigner in time, and Griffin couldn't qualify on his own. The social media posts stopped. No more restaurant check-ins, no more captions about living their best life. My mother sent a letter. She had used her careful cursive, the same handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and permission slips. She and my father had written it together, she said. It described how I had shattered the family, how I was letting legal proceedings tear apart people who loved me, how I needed to think very hard about what really matters in life. There was a lot that said I would regret this when something happened to one of them and I hadn't made peace. I read it once, I put it back in the envelope, I did not respond. I blocked my mother's number, my father's, my sister's, Griffin's 3 numbers, and the 2 numbers I didn't recognize that I was fairly confident were also his. I went through my social media accounts and quietly removed the people I was no longer willing to have a window into my life. It took about 25 minutes total. When I was done, I went to the kitchen and made Mia a grilled cheese, and we sat at the table together, and she told me about a girl at school who could hold her breath underwater for almost 30 seconds. And I listened to every single word, and I was not thinking about anyone else. In December, the director of nursing called me into her office and asked if I'd considered applying for the unit manager position that had opened on the medical surgical floor. I said I was interested. She said she thought I was ready. I interviewed in the 3rd week of December and spent the 10 days after that trying not to count the hours. The call came on a Wednesday morning before my shift. I sat in my car in the parking garage and said yes, and then sat there for another few minutes after I'd hung up, doing nothing, just sitting there with the news. I called Claudia. She brought champagne that same evening, real champagne in the flute glasses she kept in the back of her cabinet for things worth celebrating. She poured 2 and handed me one and looked at me over the rim and said, "You earned every bit of this, Nadine. Nobody handed it to you." Mia had been asking about the Saturday swim program at the community rec center since September. I'd been putting it off because I'd been picking up extra shifts on Saturdays for the supplemental income. The cushion I'd needed to keep sending money to my sister while still covering our own bills. With the manager's salary, I didn't need the extra shifts. I signed her up in February. She wore her new goggles to the car on the first Saturday and kept them on her forehead the entire drive, like she was afraid they might disappear. I sat in the observation gallery above the pool and watched her jump in without hesitating. And I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. I had to take a moment to identify it. Not just pride, something quieter. The specific relief of having put down a weight you'd carried long enough that you'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be yours. Claudia came over one evening in early spring with a rotisserie chicken and a bottle of white wine, and we sat on my living room floor because the couch was covered in Mia's art project. An elaborate crayon ocean, blue waves and green fish, and a yellow sun that took up a full third of the paper. Claudia looked at it for a while. "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "Tell me. That you could have stayed. That night at the anniversary party, you could have told Mia it was fine. Moved her plate back yourself, smoothed it over, and kept sending the money and co-signing the things and paying for the courses. A lot of people would have." I thought about that. I'd thought about it more than I expected to. The version of events where I stayed seated, where I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene, where I absorbed it the way I had been absorbing things for years. "I almost did," I said. "But she looked at you." I looked at the drawing, a blue fish with enormous eyes, mouth open, mid-leap above a bright wave. "She was waiting to see who I was going to be," I said. That was the real moment, not the anger, not even the discovery of the credit card, which had been its own particular wound. The turning point was those few seconds when Griffin had finished moving everything and Mia looked at me, and I understood that whatever I did next was going to be something she remembered, not what I said, what I did. I am a nurse. I understand wound care. I know that wounds left untreated do not close on their own. They expand, they get infected, they compromise everything around them until you finally address the source. What I did the night of my parents' anniversary dinner was not dramatic or brave, or even particularly uncommon. It was just long overdue. It was the first time I treated the wound instead of wrapping a bandage over it and hoping. Some mornings now I drive Mia to the pool before my shift. 12 minutes through Nashville while the city is still quiet, still working itself awake. She sits in the back seat with her swim bag and her always damp ponytail, and sometimes she talks the whole way, and sometimes she just watches the buildings go by, and I drive, and I think about how different the air feels. It is not a perfect life. I check my credit report more often than I probably need to. There is a court date coming up and I will likely need to testify. And I am not looking forward to that part, but I am not afraid of it. Odette said she'll come with me if I need her to. Claudia already said she's taking the morning off work. The people who actually show up without being asked. That is something I had to learn later than I should have, because for years the people who didn't show up were very loud about describing how much they loved me. Mia got her back float certification last month. She came up out of the pool and ran to the gallery railing and held her card up over her head and shouted, "Mom, look," with her whole body, dripping, grinning, not caring who heard. I looked. I am always going to look. That is the one thing I am certain of. Whatever else changes, however much harder or easier the road gets from here, I will not look away from her again. Not for the comfort of people who thought she deserved a card table in the hallway. Not for the approval of a family that chose bread baskets and wine glasses over her. I picked up her plate and I walked out the door. It turns out that was enough to start everything over.